Moving right along in this, even though we didn't have a class last week. You had spring break, so we had the week off. I should say that next week we won't have it. Let's see, we will have it on Tuesday next week. The following week we won't. We'll have it on Thursday because we'll be coming back from North Carolina that day, and we won't get in until probably 7:30 at night. And I don't think I want to teach right after getting off the plane and after that trip. So we'll have it Thursday. Next week it'll be Tuesday. The one after that it'll be Thursday. Okay, everyone understand? Very good. All right, now we're going to begin with prayer, so let's do that first. Father in heaven, we thank Thee, Lord, for Thy great blessings to us, for all that Thou hast done, for we know that Thou art the living God, that Thou holdest all things in Thine hand. And I know, O Lord, that in all of history, in all the past, and in the present, and into the future, Lord, Thou art the keeper of time, and Thou knowest all things. I pray that Thou wouldst quicken our minds and our hearts to perceive and understand the story of the ages, to understand the things that have happened, why they happened, to understand the nature of sin and the delivering power of Thy Spirit. I pray that Thou wouldst guide and direct us in our study tonight. We ask it in the name of the Lord Jesus, through the power of Thy saving blood. And I pray, O Lord, that Thou wouldst bind and cast out every hindering spirit that would try to get in our way. Help us, O Lord, to concentrate, to remember, to learn, and to understand. We ask it in Jesus' mighty and holy name. Amen. Okay, praise the Lord. Now, last time we were studying about the Middle Ages, the feudal times, Dark Ages, if you want to call it that. And I hope you remember what we studied about. Remember the Holy Roman Empire and Charlemagne and the changes that were taking place in Europe. And by the way, I hope you know your geography. I do have a map up here tonight. And when we talk about Europe, we're talking about this little part of the world, relatively small part of the world right here. Okay? Europe involves part of Russia here, and then all the way down to, let's see, you've got Italy. Italy is over here, France, Germany is here. Basically, this little circle here, this little area. Norway, Sweden, Finland. Okay, that's basically Europe in that area. Relatively small when you look at how big Asia is. Way out here. Of course, here's Africa. All right, North and South America. Okay, just so you get acquainted with the world here for a minute. We're talking about a little area right in here where all kinds of activity is going on. Now, things are going on elsewhere in the world, too. But the primary focus of events are taking place here. You see, we have to understand something. That is that this is not just a secular history class. Secular means without God. And I don't think anything can be without God. This is a history class that involves the Word of God, the Bible. The Bible tells us that there are spirits that take up a headquarters and location in certain parts of the world. And I believe that the emphasis shifts from time to time. We have seen already that the emphasis shifted from, of course, all the empires centered around the Mediterranean Sea. Do you see why they call it the Middle Sea? Right here? Okay. All right, right here. This is the Middle Sea. Okay. Here are the poles of Hercules or Gibraltar. Why was this called the Middle Sea? What do you think? Well, under it was Africa. Over it was Europe. And over here you have Asia starting in. It really was in the middle of the known world, wasn't it? Right in the very center. The Mediterranean means the Middle Sea. And of course, all the great empires rose up around about there. The Roman Empire, the Grecian Empire, Medo-Persian, and all of that, all around this great sea. But the emphasis shifted now. Everything seemed to move northward as you go up into Europe, and a major number of powers began to form up in here. Later on, the emphasis is going to shift over to a little island called England, right up here. There's Ireland, the Emerald Island. England, And then the emphasis shifts over here to the United States, which is, you might say, the ruling empire of the world at this time, but you want to remember something. We'll study this later. The United States is still controlled from England, and that's one of the best kept secrets there is. The owners of the Federal Reserve System are over here. They have agents over here in the United States, but over here in England is where the ruling elite rule the whole world. Okay? That little island, which is also called the Holy Land, as far as all the witches are concerned. The Gardnerian Brotherhood, the Alexandrian witchcraft, all the major forms of Wicca came right from here, from England. And of course, the Druids that lived there, and they lived during the time, remember we talked about the Druids a little bit during the time of the Roman Empire and just after the fall of the Roman Empire in that area of the world? The Druids had built a circular stone temple, and it wasn't enclosed. It was actually a series of what we call monoliths. A monolith is a rectangular stone. It was a monolith that was set up, and they formed like little doorways. There were two of them set upright and one set across, and formed in a circle. And the Druids believed that this was a microcosm of the whole world, and they gauged the zodiac astrology around this outdoor temple. And of course, their big festival was Samhain, Halloween. Okay? Now, what we're going to talk about tonight is Europe rising up. We talked about the Holy Roman Empire, if you remember, Charlemagne, and how the Pope put a crown on his head. Do you remember what year that was? '800, wasn't it? Okay. Charlemagne rose up in power, and he formed an empire on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church, but it eventually fizzled out and failed. He tried to unify all of the known world and revive the Roman Empire once again, but it didn't work. As time went on, a lot of things began to take place. Now remember, there were dark ages at this time, 800, 900. What do we mean by dark ages? Did the sun quit coming up? They were called dark ages. Why? Because of fear. Everybody was afraid of everybody else. Everybody in one city was afraid of everybody in another city because they didn't know when they'd be attacked, and everything they have would be taken away from them. There was no big governing power to maintain law and order, so it was called Dark Ages. As time went on, something very interesting started to take place. Okay, comment? Yeah, there were no real schools or anything to learn. You basically had to learn from a scribe or learn from a priest, learn from somebody who knew, because you didn't really have a school to go to. There were certain schools for scribes, for the elite ruling class, yeah. So yeah, there was the darkness of ignorance. But I really think that the primary reason for the darkness was the fear. Fear is an awful and terrible thing. And of course, ignorance brings forth fear, doesn't it? I mean, if you're ignorant about everything, you don't know what's going on, there's a vacuum there, and fear seems to fill that vacuum, and people get very much afraid because they don't know what's happening to them and what's happening around them, what it all means. Now, that's why the media, the newspapers, the radios, the televisions play such a vital role for the enemy. They keep people misinformed so they don't understand what is happening. Anyway, around the late 1200s, see, the Dark Ages continued. There were wars and skirmishes and fighting, but something interesting began to happen in the late 1200s. A man by the name of Marco Polo Kind of a funny name, isn't it? But Marco Polo, working with his father, went to a mysterious country called Cathay. Now, does anybody think they know where Cathay might be on the map? It was a long journey for them. They were from this little boot right here called Italy, shaped like a boot. They were from there. Marco Polo, his father, they had a shipping business. And there were certain places in the world where valuable spices and gold and silver and all kinds of valuables could be obtained and brought back and sold at a good price. Now, where did they go? Where's Cathay? China is what we now call, what was called, Cathay, way over here. Now, there was a Mongol leader of China at that time, and he was called the Kublai Khan, spelled Khan, the Kublai Khan. And he ruled China, and China was a mysterious land. Nobody knew much about it. Remember, these were dark ages. I mean, you didn't get an airplane and fly from here to here. Now, next week, my wife and I will be getting in a plane right about here and flying down to here, okay? And that's going to take us about 3 hours to go from here to here. Can you imagine in the old days now going from here to here? That's quite a distance, isn't it? Clear across the rest of Europe and all the way across Asia till you get to China. The Orient. The Orient, of course, means the East, the land of the rising sun. Marco Polo went there. And actually, his father had been there once before, and the Kublai Khan enjoyed having him there so much, he was friendly toward him, that he invited him back, and the second time he went, he brought his son Marco Polo. Marco was there for about 25 years in China. When he came back, he told some amazing stories in Europe. He went back to Italy, and when he got back to Italy, he found out there was a war going on between a couple of cities, and he was captured by one of the cities, Genoa, and he was put in jail for a while, just because they didn't like him, because he wasn't from Genoa. Okay? So they locked him up. But anyway, he came back with some very interesting things from China, things that had not really been seen before. The Chinese had this strange invention called gunpowder, and they made fireworks, and you could shoot these rockets up in the sky and they'd blow up. The Chinese had invented this and made this stuff, and they're having all kinds of fun with it. So Marco Polo came back with some of this gunpowder. Now, can you imagine if you had never seen a rocket in your life, you'd never seen gunpowder, anything explode or burn as ferociously as gunpowder does, and somebody lit some of that, if they would light that and it just took off on you? What would you think? And there's this gigantic explosion. Try to imagine if you'd never seen it before. It'd be amazing, wouldn't it? Well, he came back with all kinds of other things that the Chinese had too. The Chinese had developed a way of counting. They had something called an abacus, where it was like a calculator, but it worked with beads. And they could add and subtract and do all kinds of things with it. This was revolutionary. The Chinese had some very unique things, is what I'm saying, that Europe had never seen before. And when Marco Polo came back, they were stunned, they were amazed. He brought a lot of riches with him. Actually, Kublai Khan didn't want to let him go, but he did. And he brought a lot of wealth back with him, spices, gold, silver, the regular stuff, as riches go. So the people were just stunned when they saw some of these things. Anyway, from what we can tell, it was Marco Polo coming back from China with this whole new way of life, discoveries and inventions from the East, from the Orient, that brought on something that we call the Renaissance. which actually means a new beginning or a new age. And it started in Italy. People begin to see some of these Chinese inventions, and they begin to imagine. They begin to their mind began to wander constructively. And one of the men that came along in the 1300s, and of course that's when the Renaissance, this new period, it's a period of awakening. One of the guys that came along was a man by the name of Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was he became a lot of things. And it's believed, as far as we can tell, that all of the Renaissance was inspired by Marco Polo's discoveries, which actually were Chinese inventions. But Leonardo da Vinci began to carry everything one step further, and then one step further, and one step further. He's often remembered for his famous painting, the Mona Lisa. She's got that cute little smirk on her face. By the way, she was considered to be a raving beauty in her day. In that day, if a woman was fat, she was beautiful. Okay? If a woman were real thin, they thought she was sick and she wasn't, nothing to look at twice. Okay? So, the Mona Lisa was considered to be the outstanding, perfect female of that time. All right? So he's remembered for that. But a lot of the things that aren't talked about in regard to Leonardo da Vinci is that he was an inventor and a scientist, and he came up with some incredible discoveries. In fact, Leonardo da Vinci invented an early form of the helicopter. He put some blades together and put them on a shaft, and he was able to power this with a pedal-type structure, and it would spin, and it actually worked. It was an ancient helicopter. He conjectured that if you could spin blades which would push air, that if you pushed air, the device itself would move the opposite direction. And so he figured right, and it did work to a certain extent. He invented something called a water screw, which was an early form of a pump. What it was a rotating shaft like a drill bit, and as it would rotate, it would carry water upward and into a trough, and it could fill containers and tanks and so forth without having to lift it. He also invented an early form of an automobile. You might say, what in the world? Yeah, he invented a car. What it was a four-wheeled cart, and it ran on springs like a clock. You wind it up, and you might say, that's crazy. You mean a car with a big key, you wind it up? That's what he did. You would wind this thing up, and it would go. You release a little pedal, and the spring would start powering it, and away it would go. And he had it devised so that there was another spring, so that when one spring was unwinding, by using gears, he wouldn't diminish the power from the one spring. There'd be enough power to power the vehicle, but it would wind another spring while it was moving. So that when the first spring wound down, the other spring would be wound up. And then that, by moving a little lever, that spring would take over and keep moving the vehicle, and while it was moving, it would be winding the other spring, and it just kept going and kept going and kept going. Now, eventually it ran down, because you always lost a little bit every time it switched over. But he had quite an invention there. One of the things he tried to invent but never was able to, and it was his heart's desire, was the perpetual motion machine. He thought it would be very interesting to make something that would run by itself forever. Never have to be cranked or turned or wound up or refueled. You just start it going, and it would just keep going and going and going and going and going. He came close to it with his spring car, but you always lost a little in transition from one power source to the next. In fact, no one yet has ever invented a perpetual motion machine. Many scientists have tried, nobody's ever done it, where you could start it in motion, and by its motion, it would move another power source, and then that power source would take over, and it would be alternating power sources, one prepping the other. and then taking over. So he was really onto something, wasn't he? And this was happening in Italy, sunny Italy, as it was called. He was coming up with all this stuff, and nobody had ever seen anything like it. Can you imagine back in the 1300s? Here comes a car down the road, or a helicopter. He was way ahead of his time. But yet, isn't it strange that what he's remembered for most of all is the Mona Lisa? A painting of a woman worth millions. Okay, he painted other things too. Now, there were others that were inspired by Marco Polo and Leonardo da Vinci and these other people. One of the men who was quite well known, still is quite well remembered, is Michelangelo, who was commissioned by the Vatican to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And he painted what was supposed to be God up there in the ceiling. And with his finger extended and touching Adam's finger, and he had all these, and they are works of tremendous art. I mean, the detail is amazing. But Michelangelo hung by ropes from the ceiling. Now, you're talking about way up yonder, pretty high. I don't have the exact measurements, but I know it's in excess of 100 feet in the air. And he hung upside down, meaning on his back, by ropes, while he painted all of these pictures on the ceiling of the chapel. If you can imagine that. Okay. Well, he believed that he was commissioned by the Vatican, and of course, you know, you have to understand how Catholics think. It was like a mission for him. You know, it was going to get him to heaven. That's what you call brush stroking your way into glory land. But he was an obedient vassal serf of the Pope, actually. Very talented one. And yet all of his paintings and all the things that he did, the sculptures, he did sculpturing too, all of it involved a lot of nudity. There were very little clothes in any of the things that he ever made, which was typical of that era. Okay? Now, during this period of time, a lot of other things began to take place. Up in the rest of Europe, see, Italy was called the Italian Renaissance because that's where it began and continued, and everybody marveled at Italy. It was like Italy had come alive. But in the rest of the European nations, other things were taking place. Remember, this continent of Europe was coming out of the Dark Ages. It was still structured as a feudalistic area. I mean, that didn't just come on overnight where you flip a switch and all of a sudden, feudalism's over. Okay? It took a little time. And what was happening is men began to rise up in Europe and preach a new doctrine politically. And that is, if we are divided, we will be conquered. If we are united, we will stand. Okay? And there are various people that rose up that unified these little feudal states. Now, Germany had over 100 little states. The Germanic area. There was, for an example, Prussia. Not Russia, Prussia with a P. In German, it's Preußen. You had Brandenburg, which was a separate little state. Very small. You had Westphalia, Bavaria, the Tyrolean area, the Saar, the Schwarzwald, Black Forest. You had all these different regions, different little states, and what happened is a man, this is some time later now, because we're covering a period of 400 years here. I'm taking you from 1300 up to about 1700 when I'm talking about all of this. And I'm going to shoot some names out at you, and I would like you to do a report on one of these names that I'm going to be naming. You can kind of select it, or maybe I should appoint it. That way we don't have any muss and fuss here. Okay, I would like a report on, let me just assign these now. I'd like a report on Otto von Bismarck. The man who took all the little German states and united them into one united Germany. Oh, let's see. Who would enjoy that one? Well, I can just imagine Nate would enjoy Otto von Bismarck. He became the first Chancellor of Germany, the Iron Chancellor. You know what his motto was? Blut und Eisen. That means blood and iron. Okay? He had another kind of a strange one, strange considering the kind of a character he was, and that is, he was often heard to say, Gott mit uns, God with us. He didn't say which God, but he did say God with us. Okay? But the Iron Chancellor, blood and iron, and he united Germany into a country where it had been over 100 little feudalistic states. Okay, all the way from Oberammergau in the south, clear on up to Hamburg and Frankfurt and Berlin, up in the Danzig area. Okay, so he was a very busy man. The other countries began to form. France began to rise up as a nation. Spain began to come together as a major power. And whenever a power began to rise up, a nationalistic power, a massive army or navy rose up with it. You have to understand that. A nation was known by its muscle, by its army, and by its navy. So you had France rising up. You had Spain rising up. You had Germany rising up. You had Britain rising up. All of these things began to happen in this little short period of time, relatively short time, of a couple of hundred years. Right after the Renaissance. Can you see that there were spirits at work? And there was a power shift spiritually? And the telltale sign of that was a visible power shift in the natural sense. Whenever there is a power shift spiritually, there will be physical evidence of that shortly thereafter. Do you understand how that works? In other words, it'll become visible. We don't see what's going on in the spirit realm. There are things spiritually discerned, but they become visible and tangible, audible, detectable. Okay? So, we have Otto von Bismarck, and of course, Nate's going to take care of Otto von Bismarck. I also need somebody to do a Sir Francis Drake for me. And I can't help but think that we can give that one to Sam. He'd like to do a Sir Francis Drake. He was no saint, believe me. He was a very cruel man, in fact. He was nice to his sailors, but in battle he was merciless. Okay. So those are two of the profiles that I want done. I'd also like somebody to take, now we're going to get into the religious side of this. I think maybe about a 2-page paper. That sounds about right, doesn't it? About 2 pages long, handwritten. Okay. If you want to do more, that's fine. How about Martin Luther? I need somebody to do one on Martin Luther. Let's see. Who would like to do Martin Luther? Probably Rebecca. That'd be good. Okay. Now I've got a real good one for Shelley. Shelley's going to really like this one. Ignatius de Loyola. Okay. Ignatius is Ignatius, and a small de, and Loyola, Loyola. Okay? Now, if we can see if we can have those. Now, I think, and I've got Jane and Vicki here that really need to do something too. And Sarah's not here tonight, but she does need to. I think what I'm going to do is have Sarah do John Calvin. another reformer. Okay, and I think I'm going to have Jane do King Henry VIII of England, and I'm going to have Vicki do Christopher Columbus. Okay, I think that covers everyone that's here. Now, aren't you glad you came and have this assignment? You'll have all kinds of fun with this. Okay, let's look at this just a little more now. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, nations began to form in Europe, and this had never happened before. France, Spain, Germany, and Britain became the predominant countries. And we said armies and navies began to rise up. Of course, we all know what happened in 1492, don't we? During this period of time. A man by the name of Christopher Columbus, having obtained, now he was an Italian man, wasn't he? He was an Italian man. Using charts that were drawn up by Amerigo Vespucci, another Italian man, from which you get the name America, from Amerigo. He was a chart maker, a map maker. And of course the compass had been discovered. The sextant had been discovered, so you could navigate by sea. Christopher Columbus conjectured that the world is round because he would watch ships go out to sea, and they would get smaller and smaller, and they'd reach a vanishing point on the horizon, and they would disappear. Now, the word horizon is an interesting word, too. Did you ever wonder where the word horizon came from? It came from the words Horus, rising. Horus was, of course, one of the ancient gods of Egypt. Okay? So the sun, of course, would come up on the horizon, and Horus would rise to his place of prominence in the sky. The son of the sun god in Egypt. Another name for Satan. Kind of interesting, isn't it? Okay. Now, Christopher Columbus, a very proud and arrogant man. I know they try to make a saint out of him, but he was a very proud and arrogant man. Obtained money from King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, and decided he would set out to find a short route to the land of the spice and all the good things, the Orient to the east. But he believed he could, you'll note he headed west, and he was looking for India. As he began to travel, he had 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, Santa Maria. Santa Maria was his flagship. Of course, in Spanish that means Saint Mary. You have to understand these wood ships had a problem. You generally could make a fairly good distance with them, but a lot of times you had trouble getting back because you had to put pitch and tar on the boards because they start to leak. You could sail probably about 1,000, 1,500, maybe 2,000 miles at the very most, and you'd start to spring a lot of leaks. Well, anyway, Christopher Columbus, with his other 2 ships, began to sail. Now, he discovered an area which he called San Salvador. He discovered what we now call the West Indies, which are located, see, he set out here, and he sailed, and of course you have what are called the trade winds, and there are currents through here. Anyway, any ship that's just left to drift will end up down here by accident, okay? Once you get into this area where the currents are, where the trade winds are, you'll end up down. Your ship will just go there by itself, okay? So he ended up down in this area, all these little islands. You've got Cuba and Bermuda and all these little, and you've got Haiti is down here, and Dominican Republic and all these little areas. And the northern portion of South America, All of this was discovered and became very Spanish after that, because he claimed this new world to the King of Spain. And of course, Florida became Spanish. All right? And these European nations now began to claim areas on the other side of the hemisphere. Now, there was a dividing line going right through Greenwich, England, called the Prime Meridian. As you would go this side of the Prime Meridian, you would be in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, the other side is Eastern Hemisphere. East and West divided by the Prime Meridian. Okay? But anyway, so they began to claim these little islands and these little lands here and there. It was the discovery of a new world. Something now was shifting again. But we'll come back to that point, because we still have some things to finalize in Europe. Very important things that begin to take place. Now, while these nations, France, Spain, Germany, and Britain, were rising up, and men like Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, began to rise up with a great nation of Germany, and France came out with what they thought was the most powerful army in the world, the La Grande Armée, and Britain came out with what they felt was the most powerful navy in the world, and it did prove to be. Spain also had a great and powerful navy. Now, these countries began to fight with one another, these big nations. The Renaissance was winding down. It was an ongoing thing from 1300 on, but now everything began to change and fighting began to break out once again. And I'm going to show you, now the history books won't tell you this, but I'm going to show you why all these European wars came about. Why France and Spain were fighting with Germany and especially with Britain. One of the things that took place was the Reformation. In the early 1500s, it was really in full swing. It was going in the 1400s too. One of the men who really got it going was a man named Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a young Catholic boy, very, very Catholic. His father was Catholic, mother was Catholic. Everybody was Catholic back then, if you were anything. See, the Catholic Church sent out missionaries everywhere. When they sent out their missionaries to all these European nations and wherever they went, they let them keep their pagan gods and goddesses and do all the traditional things they did. They just gave it all Catholic-sounding names. Okay? They Catholicized everything, including heathenism. Now, Martin Luther was studying, or was going to study, to be an attorney. His father wanted him to be a lawyer. That's where the money was, and that's where the control was. You get in politics that way. Gain advantages. One day during a thunderstorm, as he was walking home, lightning became so fierce, crashing from the sky, and he just felt for certain that he was going to die. This lightning was coming so close to him. He fell to his knees, and he made a vow that if St. Anne would protect him, that he would become a monk and a Catholic priest, and that he would do this, begin to do this right away. He was protected from the storm. In other words, the lightning didn't strike him. I don't think St. Anne had anything to do with it. But anyway, he went home and told his father he was not going to be a lawyer. He's going to be a Catholic priest. His father flipped out, and he proceeded to keep his promise. So this young boy from Eisleben, Germany, became a great reformer. And it's a long story how he did this, and I'm only going to briefly mention this because it's very important to world history. Something happened here that changed the whole course of world history, in fact. We know how Martin Luther rebelled against the Catholic system. He was a devout Augustinian priest. He had a congregation. He had a church, a large congregation. And he made the discovery quite by accident, although I believe it was the Lord leading him to that extent. He just didn't follow far enough. But to him it was an accident. He found a verse that says you're justified by faith and not by works. And it intrigued him because in the Catholic system it's all works. You have to earn your way to heaven. Well, having discovered this, he was thrilled with it and began to preach it in his church among the congregation. And everybody began to get happy. They didn't have to beat themselves anymore. They didn't have to cut themselves anymore and say rosaries and all this stuff anymore. And he began to bring more and more changes about, and finally the Pope heard about it and got extremely angry. Okay? No, it was after he'd gone to Rome, and he was very distressed with Rome. He was still very much a Catholic. He hadn't made that discovery yet when he went to Rome. When he got back from Rome, and the reason I can teach you this is because I was brought up as a Lutheran, and we studied Lutheran church history for years and years and years. It was a big emphasis in the school that I went to. But no, he went to Rome when he was very much Catholic, and of course when he got to the city, he expected angels to be flying around or something. He thought it would be just the holiest place. And he saw drunken priests in the gutter with women and laying in their own vomit and just disgusting things. The priests would be wearing their clerical robes and everything. He discovered that the Pope was entertained by over 100 nude female dancers. Things like this just disillusioned him. He came prepared to climb the steps in the Vatican, the cement steps on his knees, going both up and down to do penance. So he was very, very much a Catholic. After he got back from Rome, he was really disillusioned. In fact, he said that he felt like he didn't believe in God anymore. That's all he knew was Catholicism. He began to talk to other priests and tell them, how can this be? You know, the corruption is so great. Is there really a God? You know, if this is the church, it's filthy. How can this be? And he was about ready to give up. And he said, I guess I'm a heretic. I just can't believe anymore. He actually made the statement, I just can't believe anymore. And then he found his way inside that church, and he opened a page in the Bible in desperation. And it said, by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It's a gift of God, and not that of works, lest any man should boast. He turned to another page that said, the just shall live by faith. And it started to come alive to him. The Lord revealed it to him there. And he began to preach that. And the people were intrigued by it. Finally, he was called before the council. And, of course, he had been teaching all these things they considered were heresy. They told him he had to recant. The old bishop was there himself. And he said, you have to recant of this, take it back, admit that you were wrong. And that's, of course, when he made his famous speech, lifting up a Bible high into the air over his head. He said, Hier stehe ich kann nicht anders tun. Here I stand, I can do nothing else. He said, I will not recant this unless you prove that I'm wrong by the Bible, which they couldn't do. All they had was the writings of the popes and councils. They couldn't prove it by the Bible. Thus, he was threatened. They tried to kill him a number of times. He responded. He nailed a list of 95 theses, or 95 reasons why the church was wrong, on the church door at Wittenberg in Germany. And he was protected by a German prince, Georg the Younger. And he took care of him and made sure he was protected. And during that time, he rewrote the Bible, translated it very meticulously and carefully from the Textus Receptus. He translated the scripture into the German language so the common people could read it. Heretofore, it had only been in Latin. and very few people could read Latin. Okay? So, you had Luther, and then you had men like Zwingli, Calvin, Knox, and Tyndale, various other ones that came along and resisted the Catholic Church. But another man, in addition to Martin Luther, that came to the forefront, although under less honorable circumstances, was King Henry VIII of England. King Henry VIII was a selfish, arrogant glutton. He had a wife. He didn't like her, so he got rid of her. He had another wife, and he accused her of adultery because, she couldn't produce a male child to take the throne for him, and he wasn't able to bring forth any male children from the woman he had, so he accused her of adultery to get rid of her and had her head chopped off, Anne Boleyn. And then, of course, that's where all those stories, the British all know these stories about how she had her head chopped off in the Tower of London, and her ghost haunts the Tower of London. And they got that song they sing about her. With her head tucked underneath her arm, she walks the bloody tower. Did you ever hear that? I started in the wrong key here. That's pretty bad for a locksmith, isn't it? With her head tucked underneath her arm, she walks the bloody tower. With her head tucked underneath her arm at the midnight hour. There's a whole bunch of verses that go with it. But he had her killed. She was innocent. He just had her head chopped off. He didn't want her anymore. So he married another woman, and you can study some of this on your own if you want. And he wanted to get rid of her. By the way, this guy, I said, was a glutton. He was known to eat a whole turkey as a midnight snack. He'd order his cooks to prepare a turkey so he could get up out of bed and eat it and go back to bed. I mean, the whole thing. That's a big bird, right? This guy was an absolute pig. Okay. But anyway. And he was the king of England, so nobody's going to mess with him or their head would roll. So that's the way it was. You just had to obey royalty. Anyway, when he got to one particular wife, he wanted to get an annulment. He just, I suppose he didn't really want to chop her head off. He just wanted the marriage annulled. So he had to apply to the Pope to get an annulment for the marriage. The Pope said absolutely not. And he said, fine, so much for you, Pope. I'll start my own church. He took the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was Catholic. He said, guess what, Archbishop? You are now the new Pope of England. And they started what was called the Anglican Church, the Church of England, which is known also as the Episcopal Church. It started because King Henry VIII couldn't get an annulment and ditch his wife. That's how that church started. Can you imagine going to a church like that? Okay, comment? Yeah, he had about as many wives as Liz Taylor has had husbands. But anyway, so what happened is he started a church in rebellion against Rome. Now, can you see something start to happen here? Watch this. Luther rebelled against Rome, and that divided Germany up. Many German princes became Lutherans. Henry VIII started a church and rebelled against Rome. Rome was getting in a real pickle here. They were having trouble. Spain and France remained loyal to Rome. Germany and Britain did not. Furthermore, as a result of this religious reformation, a man rose up with a counter-reformation. He believed it was his divine call to fight the Reformation and make Catholicism supreme again and destroy all heretics, all Protestants. And that man's name was Ignatius de Loyola. Ignatius Loyola started, oh, by the way, there is a city in Upper Michigan, on the Upper Peninsula, named for this man, St. Ignace. They made a saint out of him. Ignatius de Loyola started a secret order of priests called the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits. In fact, we've got a major branch of that right down in Milwaukee, Marquette University, because Father Marquette, as he was called, was a Jesuit. The Jesuit became the most powerful movement within the Catholic Church. They took a very strange Spanish name for themselves, too, a secret name. Even though they call themselves Jesuits, they also call themselves Ilumbrados, which is a Spanish equivalent of Illuminati. Now, the Illuminati is not Catholic, but the Catholic system is very much involved in the Illuminati. It's not just Catholic, is what I'm saying. It's a lot bigger than that. Now, what happened then is Loyola recruited all of these priests and taught them how to deceive, how to plant people in Protestant churches, to destroy them. All different ways to secretly destroy the leaders of the Protestant movement and try to stop the Reformation. Furthermore, Loyola, responding to the Pope's orders, now let me back up a minute. The Pope gave France and particularly Spain strict orders that their armies were to wipe out the Protestant armies. In other words, France was to fight England. Spain was to fight England. Germany, of course, was to be fought by the portion of Germany that was Catholic. There were to be wars, such as the 30 Years' War and the Austrian Catholic movement, the Habsburgs, and so forth. This was all driven by the Vatican. And the word Vatican in classical Latin means divination, so you can see, or witchcraft, so you can see there's a very strange power play here. Furthermore, I had mentioned that Britain became a major naval power. They had a big navy, and the Pope ordered that navy of Britain destroyed. So the Spanish were sent to do the job. Now the Spanish had a large, or what they called armada of ships. They were a very powerful navy as well, these old Spanish galleons. And what the Jesuits did is they were trained fighters. Priests, yes, but trained fighters. And they'd get on these ships and control them. You have to understand something. The order of the Jesuits had a leader over them. Loyola was the first leader, but he was called the General of the Order. They still have a General of the Order. That's his title. Their secret password is ad majorem Dei gloriam. It's Latin. It means to the greater glory of God. Ad majorem Dei gloriam. Anyway, they got on these Spanish ships, and the Jesuits had their own flag. It was a black flag with a skull with two bones crossing each other under the skull. They referred to it as the Jolly Roger. It's commonly known as a pirate flag. But it's the Jesuits that came up with this flag, and this flag was used to attack British ships and steal their gold and try to destroy them because they were Protestants. This went on back and forth. There were battles fought. Finally, a naval captain by the name of Sir Francis Drake came along in the 1500s. The British captain, Sir Francis Drake, began to fight the Jesuit Spanish ships, and I do emphasize Jesuit, even though the history books don't tell you that. And this finally came to a head. They fought back and forth in sea battles, and finally in this little area called the English Channel, between England and France, a great battle was fought. and the Spanish Armada, Catholic-driven, were fought by Sir Francis Drake, who had a much smaller force, but very small and fast ships, destroyed the Spanish Armada. As a result, the Spanish Armada the few ships they had left fled into the Northern Sea. They went around by Ireland, hoping the Irish would help them because they were what? Catholic. See how that worked? This is a Protestant Catholic thing. Ever since Henry VIII broke off and started his own popery with the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope said he had to go. Britain had to be punished, but he was unable to do it. When Sir Francis Drake defeated the Spanish Armada, what was left of it went over near Ireland, and the Irish refused to help him, even though they were all Catholic. Okay? In fact, Ireland itself is divided, is it not? Northern Ireland and Ireland itself, the old nation. The old nation is Catholic. Northern Ireland isn't. You see, it's a religious war. So ever since the Protestant Reformation, which was not of God particularly, I believe God used certain men that were in it, but I don't believe it's God ordained, okay? It brought about a lot of events, wars, struggles, all kinds of fighting. Now something else happened in Europe. I'm going to have to move along quickly. We're out of time already, but I'm going to take about 5 minutes yet because I have to cover this material. During all of this time of the Reformation, of the rise through the Renaissance and out of the Dark Ages, something else was going on behind the scenes. There were a lot of people that were craftsmen. There were silversmiths and goldsmiths and those that would work with stone and all different kinds of building materials, carpenters and so forth. And they had organizations that they formed. They were called guilds. They were like labor unions. And if you were in this labor union, if you were in this guild, they protected your trade secrets. And they began to find it necessary to have secret passwords, so they knew that people that were wanting to be admitted really belonged there when they'd have meetings. Because somebody might come from a different part of Europe or a different country. How would you know they're a real carpenter or a real stonemason or a real goldsmith or whatever? So they had their own little passwords, and then they developed their own little handshakes and so forth. This developed, these little secret societies developed into one big one called the Grand Orient, the Lodges of the Grand Orient, which became Masonic lodges. They came forth from the guild movement, secret societies, secret passwords, secret handshakes, and so forth. So that began to happen. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, isn't there? France is rising up with a big army to try to punish England for being Protestant. You've got all these little wars going on in Germany with the Habsburgs and the different people because some are Catholic, some are Protestant. And so there was civil war in Germany. And of course you have this Otto von Bismarck coming along and begins to change things. So all of this stuff is going on at the same time. It isn't like one thing gives way to another. It just seems like it is a big ball of yarn. I mean, everything is happening simultaneously. Now, after Sir Francis Drake beat the Spanish Armada, Britain had an undisputed control of the sea. From 1588 onward, all nations were subservient to Britain on the sea. Oh, incidentally, we talked about Columbus a while back and how he discovered the West Indies. He was not the first one over to that area. Actually, we know, and there's a lot of evidence for this, the Vikings had sailed up the St. Lawrence, through the Great Lakes, all the way over to Minnesota. They found Viking tools and other relics and rune stones and all kinds of things in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area of Minnesota. They had sailed all the way through there. So Columbus didn't discover the New World. The Scandinavians did. The Vikings. You've heard of Eric the Red. He was a well-known Viking. And he had a son named Leif, L-E-I-F. Leif, who was Eric's son, so they call him Leif Erikson. See, the way the Scandinavians did their names, they had a continuity of names. If your father's name was John, you would be John's son, so your name would become Johnson. If your father's name was Anders, another name for Andrew, but it's Scandinavian, you would become Anders' son. Okay? And then if you had a son, see, this would just carry on. And it would change, and the last names would change with every generation. But you had a record. You could trace it back that way. It was like climbing a ladder. Okay? Yeah, so it looked real confusing, but it worked. And you actually could trace it. So anyway, in addition to that, I mentioned that Columbus was a very arrogant man, very Catholic man, very... He wanted as a reward to be given a title. I think it was Admiral of the Ocean Seas, or some big long title that he wanted to be called. And it showed where his pride was. There was no pride in his family at all, because he got it all. See? Okay. Now, then what happened is, during all this reform that was going on, and the inventions through the Renaissance, and the forming of the nations, and the big armies and navies that came up, there was a struggle for supremacy, and the struggle ended with Britain coming out on top. Now, after Britain came out on top, something else happened that would also change the entire world. And I'm going to take about a minute or two here, and we're going to finish with this. When Britain controlled the seas, they began to build an empire. They began to travel and claim land for themselves. One of the areas they claimed for themselves was right here. It became New England. They came over and landed on... Now, the Dutch were involved in this, too. There were trading companies, okay? But Britain controlled it. And any other nation who wanted to trade on the seas had to pay money to Britain for the privilege of doing it. They had to pay for the British to allow them to ship anything. Okay? So, you had the Dutch involved, which is why there's so much of a Dutch influence in New York. Okay? New York became, actually, before it was New York, it was New Amsterdam. Very, very Dutch. But New England was one of the areas they claimed. They also claimed some areas over here in Africa. The Dutch had South Africa, but Britain took several other areas along the coast. Britain took and controlled Hong Kong over here, Singapore, the Falkland Islands down here, okay, Gibraltar up here. Now you can notice something with these British navies controlling this. There was no Panama Canal. Anybody who wanted to sail to the other end of the Pacific, and Sir Francis Drake actually did discover California. He gallivanted all over the world. But Britain controlled all the major waterways, the shipping lanes. If you wanted to get through the Mediterranean, from the Mediterranean anywhere in here, through Gibraltar, you had to pay. a lot of money. So these countries could never make enough money. They had to do all this work, go through all this effort, and had to pay Britain. Everybody hated the British. Everybody hated the British with a great and exceeding great hatred. Russia, big Mother Russia up here, had no warm water port. It was icy up here. They couldn't ship here. Over here by Petropavlovsk and Vladivostok, in this area, it was difficult to ship. They always had trouble with the Japanese, which was another problem. Japan being right here. So the only real good warm water port they could possibly have would be through Istanbul, or Constantinople as it was called, the Bosporus region, Hellespont, Bosporus region here. That would get them from the Black Sea out into the Mediterranean, out into the Atlantic. But lo and behold, the British controlled Istanbul. The British controlled Gibraltar. Over here, the British controlled the Falkland Islands by the Strait of Magellan. The British controlled Hong Kong and Singapore, the shipping lanes in here. They took every shipping lane and locked it up tight all over the world with their navy. And you had to pay. That caused a resistance movement, which we'll talk about a little bit hopefully next time, as entire regions began to rise up against Britain and try to fight them. Okay? So everything's centering now on Britain. Okay. Also, in Europe, a new secret society began to form, which unified all the little secret societies. Remember, the little secret societies became a part of what was called the Grand Orient. And you know who headed up the whole Grand Orient, all the secret societies? The Lord Mayor of London, Britain again, took the supremacy and controlled it all. Even the Germans' Freimaurer, Freemason Lodge, was subservient to the Lord Mayor of London. So, what I'm going to talk about next time is I'm going to show you how a secret society rose up and how the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and all of these things were planned in advance. Even our American Civil War was planned in advance in England.